So I would like to also invite, please, to the podium, the last panel. And it's actually very timely because we've covered the EU Common Security and Defense Policy also from many defense aspects when we had the speakers, of course, always from the European External Action Service. But we are the European Union, we are the Union of 28 member states, so I'm very happy that now we will discuss actually the aspects, the national links, the member states' links to the common security and foreign policy. And I will give the floor to the moderator, Ms. Jacqueline Grapin from the European Institute. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, it's nice we have a small group at this time of the day. It's late, and we are in the seminar format, so this should allow for a good discussion, more than the large conference format. We're fortunate to have with us several experienced experts. I apologize for shortening the bios. They have long, very distinguished bios, but in interest of time, I will limit myself to saying that Major General Buster Hose is Defense Attaché at the British Embassy. He has been planner in the Rapid Reaction Force Operations Staff at UN Pro 4 in Bosnia. He was also a strategist in the Naval Staff Directorate in the Ministry of Defense. He was Chief Joint Coordination and Effects in Kabul and then Director of the Naval Staff. He served as head of overseas operations in the Ministry of Defense before being appointed Commandant General Royal Marines in 2010. General Rose also commanded Operation Atlanta, the EU counter-piracy mission in the Indian Ocean. General Bruno Caïtucoli is a defense attaché at the Embassy of France. He has logged more than 2,700 flight hours, including 119 combat sorties. It doesn't look like when we look at you. He participated in Desert Storm and in the French Operation Épervier in Chad and Central African Republic. He also participated in deliberate force in Bosnia-Herzegovina and provided comfort in northern Iraq. He participated in the air presence mission over Bosnia and Kosovo and served as head of the Peacekeeping and Crisis Management Office in the Delegation of Strategic Affairs in the Ministry of Defense. He was also posted for 3 years to NATO headquarters in Brussels as strategic issue team leader within the international military staff. And before coming to Washington as Defense Attaché, he was Assistant Director for Doctrine in the Joint Concept Doctrine and Experiment Center in Paris. I should also mention that he was commander of the Cambrai Air Force Base and commander of the Épervier Force in Chad. Michel is a distinguished research fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies. After 17 years in the Office of the Secretary of Defense as Director for NATO Policy, Director for Non-Nuclear Arms Control, Secretary of Defense Representative to the US-Russia Bilateral Consultative Commission, and Deputy Director for Verification Policy. Michel also previously served as an analyst in the US Intelligence Committee, a legislative aide to a member of Congress, and a US Navy officer. And Professor Sven Biscop is director of the Europe in the World program at the Egmont Royal Institute for International Relations in Brussels, and visiting professor at Ghent University and at the College of Europe in Bruges. He chairs the jury of the annual European Defence Agency Egmont PhD Prize in European Defence, Security and Strategy, and he sits on the Executive Academic Board of the European Security and Defence College. We will listen to your introductions, gentlemen, and then I have a few questions for you. We have questions, I'm sure, also in this room, and we will have a passionate discussion.
Thank you, Madam. I have 5 minutes I've never been described as an expert in anything before, so thank you for that compliment. Where I come from, marine is in fact an acronym for muscles are required, intelligence not essential. So you've sat here to the graveyard watch to find enlightenment. I fear I may disappoint. I'd just like to start where the day started and pick up some of John Hamry's comments. I mean, he threw down quite a robust and heartfelt provocation at the outset of this conference and characterized America as being a sort of Hobbesian, dystopian viewed society which saw life as nasty, brutish and short, and meanwhile Europe living in a kind of Elysian, utopian la-la land, and that we had traded off your insurance policy for too long. He pointed at particularly the collaborations, and one being structural and treaty-based, which was normative, and the other being coalitions of the willing. I propose a hybrid, which is that the structural and treaty-based, NATO, EU through CSDP and UN, form more pragmatic and effective coalitions of the willing. In other words, that pragmatism has to drive the bus, that as funds become tighter, we need to be less sensitive about cooperating. I was listening to an EU official yesterday who was dancing around the very term cooperation. Well, you just heard Admiral Tarrant speak about trying to police 2.3 million square miles of water with 5 DC police cars, if I can mix a complicated metaphor. So it seems to me that understanding how plugs and sockets are plugged together, and that is a really good example, one which I know a little bit about, is the bottom line. And that we just need to not, for example, try to turn the EU's military capability through CSDP into something that approximates to NATO. If there is a new normal in the Ukraine, and I think time will tell, and the way to address such problems upstream is to build capacity, and the European Union has such abilities through a comprehensive approach, then play to those strengths, develop those strengths, find ways of integrating those strengths with sometimes the robuster and harder edge of NATO. That seems to be entirely acceptable thing to do. I'd just like to make one other comment, which is at one point today, there was a statement made in terms of soft power, however you construe it, sanctions, which would take Russia back to the dark ages economically, quote unquote. My only comment to that is that if you take people back to medieval times, don't be surprised if they act in a brutal manner. So we need to be sophisticated. People who look at the problem and think that, you know, to every simple problem there is for every complex problem there is a simple, neat and wrong solution. You know, this is going to be tricky, and strategic patience will be key to the way we deal with it.
Thank you. And thank you for sticking to the 5 minutes.
Nearly. There is something wrong because you did that even in less than 5 minutes, so you raised the bar so low that I think I cannot match with it. Okay, anyway. So thank you very much, Jacqueline. I'm very happy to be in the same panel as my colleague with you, because you were the very first to give me the opportunity to address an audience a few weeks after my arrival in Washington, D.C. 3 years ago. So I tried to modify my remarks all along the day, and I ended up with 3 very simple ideas that I would like to offer you, and then I am looking for the discussion. The first idea is, in my view, something we very often hear in NATO, a bit less in the EU, is the strength of the EU, like any other international organization, is based on member states' willingness to do things or not. I would like to take 3 areas in which it's obvious. The ambition, for instance, when the UK and the French met at Saint-Malo, is these 2 nations who, I think, proposed to the others, and it was finally accepted by all the member states, that yes, the EU could conduct autonomous operations, in particular in Africa, and so on and so forth. So that ambition was initially proposed by some member states, 2 in that particular case. In the area of doctrines and concepts, that's exactly the same. When we were deployed in Congo and we drew the lessons learned from Artemis, we came with the idea of having those battle groups that could be the appropriate format of an easy force to deploy in the framework of an EU-led operation, and then 3 nations this time, if I'm correctly remembering. The Germans, the British, and the French proposed that to the other nations, and it was accepted, the concept of the EU battle group. And of course, in the framework of the operations, that even more obvious, because no operation will be launched by the European Union if there is no nation willing to provide troops in that. Now, having said that, so the engine in the EU is the member states. There is a pause here. I cannot remember in recent months a moment that we have discussed a higher level of ambition or even an ambition. I'm a little bit provocative here, but that's something that it's my feeling. In concept and doctrine, we are, I would say, quite conservative. We use the ones we have, but we do not question really the necessity to adapt and to create new tools. And in the framework of operations, we are very prudent. At the moment, the last operation we have launched are training mission, absolutely critical, but they are training missions. Similarly, I think the member states need the EU if they really want to be effective. So that's a win-win game, if you will. And that's a comprehensive approach business. So if one nation decides to commit forces somewhere, without, benefiting the availability of tools that are not the military force, then where is the exit strategy? How can we be successful if we just commit forces? It doesn't work. So that's really something that I think is a two-way street. The European Union need the commitment of the member states to really make progress and be strong. And similarly, the nations who would like to conduct operations absolutely need the European Union to be very effective. The second idea is that, and I go back to the level of ambition, the EU, in my view, and it's just my opinion, must be able to conduct any kind of operation to include the high level of the spectrum. And there is a good reason for that. If you remember for a while the context when we launched the operation in Libya, in this country, there was not much appetite to launch a new operation. So we could, picture a scenario in the future in which, because the US is very busy somewhere, or is not willing to commit forces in a particular area, and the European Union has interest at stake somewhere, then we would end up in a position where we have no alternative. We need to commit forces by ourselves. So if we want to be able to do that, then we should prepare for it. And that's the reason why I think we should have permanently, as a level of ambition, this scenario in which we would commit forces by our own without the potential support of our big and very powerful ally. Now, if this ally wants to come with us, of course, that's good news, and that's welcome. The third idea, very briefly, is on capability development. I think that's a very important point for me. With some exceptions, very few exceptions that we can explain, but that will take longer. If you compare the evolution of the budgets, the defense budgets across the Europe, and the remaining defense industries in nations, that's really parallel tracks. So the less in Europe defense industry, you have in one particular country, the less that country is investing in defense. So in the long term, if we continue that path, then that's very clear. There will be no partner for the US, for instance, in Europe. And that's our common interest, as I said before, to be able to defend our own interest by ourselves. So the recommendation here is we desperately need to organize ourselves in such a way that we preserve or even develop our European industry if we want governments to continue to invest in defense. Otherwise, they will just should continue decreasing the budgets, and at the end, of course, with no budgets, there is absolutely no strength, no force, and no capability to intervene anywhere. That's the 3 points I wanted to offer to initiate the debate.
Thank you, Bruno.
Thank you.
What you just said wanted me to ask a question that anybody can answer, but I remember that when President Sarkozy arrived after he was elected, one of the very first things he said was, we cannot continue to have France and the UK bear more than 50% of the burden of European defense. We need to rebalance that. And he intended to negotiate with the other European countries. He started some kind of a negotiation, but it did not take 2 months before the subject disappeared from the agenda, and it has not resurfaced very much since then. My question is, why is it so difficult? And what you just mentioned about industry, defense industry, would it not be a way to convince certain states to devote more resources to security and defense if they knew that they are going to get more employment from these activities? And are there other ways to convince those states? Because there are many countries, partners in both NATO and CSDP, but not everybody contributes, and not everybody contributes proportionally at the same level. What is your view?
So thank you. Of course, I'm not going to comment on what the president has said because by definition he's right. But the point I would like to make is related to the way we invest money and the way we can collectively be better. First, we have done something together. It's called the Lancaster House Treaty. I know you don't call it this way, but in French we call it this way. So we try to do as much as we can with our British colleagues because we are very similar. We have a lot of things in common, and I'm not going to tell you the contrary because my father is a veteran of World War II and he fought the war in a British unit. So we feel very close, culturally speaking, same size, the same way of approaching operations. So there is a good rationale to do things together. But the most important point for me is instead of focusing on the amount of money we spend, we should focus on the way we spend it. We very often speak about the famous 2% of the GDP, etc. Well, and I will, under General Palomero's watch, use a NATO document because they put forward a very interesting diagram that shows the percentage of the defense budget a particular nation spent in research and development and acquisition of high-level, capacities. You have in NATO countries investing out of $100, dollars, let's say, $28, $29 in research and development and top-level capabilities. That's the case of the US. That's the case of France. A couple of others. You have a group of nations above the 20% mark, but you have also nations under the 5% mark. And why that? Because they have, for instance, enormous, very large number of battalions that are absolutely not deployable, not, I would say, useless, it's a bit extreme, but certainly not very useful for the modern type of operation that we intend to conduct together. So, and here, instead of, stopping the decrease of defense budget, the way we could better use that amount of money that is available is really full of promises. We can do a lot with these budgets. And last, when we do things in common in the capability development area, it does much more than just this. If you take the example of France and Germany, after the war, France developed a transport aircraft that was called the Nord Atlas, purely national. Then we moved to the Transal, and this piece of equipment led the French military transport and the Lufttransport Commando in Germany very close to each other. And I think it's because they have shared a lot of common experiences that we now have a European Air Transport Command. And we have probably the A400M, etc., etc. That's the beginning of a journey we need to do things together, and capability development is certainly an area very promising in my view.
Thank you. I just gave you 3 minutes.
Sorry.
General Host, would you like to comment on this?
Well, the question you ask of Europe is the question America, in terms of the other partners of Europe with respect to Britain and France, is a question America asks of all of Europe. And the answer is a confection of culture, politics, history, and a whole load of other things. I mean, the complexion I'd put on it, beyond what Bruno has said, is that, and he put this observation into his main remark, is it also boils down to willpower. So, they not only need to have the capability, but the will to use it. And I think part of America's dialogue with Europe is about who are the serious partners. Butcher's bills are inelegant and invidious things at the best of times, but Britain has lost 452 people in Afghanistan. I don't say that with any pride. I say it with profound regret. But it is indicative of the fact that, we will step up when we need to with blood and treasure. There's no point in having the treasure if you're not prepared to sacrifice the blood, and I think that is just as much of an issue.
Thank you. Perhaps you can comment as part of your introductions on this. Sven, would you like to intervene?
Thanks to the EU delegation, first of all, for inviting me over, even though I find I'm in a difficult spot in a panel on the national perspective, because I'm Belgium, and Belgium is many things, but it's definitely not a nation. And even if it were, I would not dare to risk to get it into trouble by pretending to speak on its behalf. So let me give you the bishop's point of view. You'll have to tell me whether that makes me an Episcopalian. I do not know the intricacies of American religion. I want to say 2 words on capabilities and one on strategy. On capabilities, to use a very risky expression, I think it really is the hour of Europe. It seems to me that the pragmatists on both sides of the Atlantic have realized that our only chance to get more European capability is by using the CSDP and the European Commission. After all, it's a European problem. The only way we're going to solve it is by more cooperation among the Europeans. And it's just not more easy, but perhaps less difficult in a format where these Europeans sit together, and that's the CSDP. And there are 2 levels to this. One is the strategic enablers, for which now we almost entirely have to rely on the United States. The European Council, a bit optimistically, welcomed projects in 4 areas already: air-to-air refueling, drones, cyber and satellite communication. And it's now urgent that we make them work, which means that more member states need to contribute more to these programs. And we should not forget that actually 2 years before that, the Foreign Affairs Council prioritized 8 more areas. So it's not just these 4; it's the other 8 as well that we need to make happen. One achievement of the European Council last December that wasn't mentioned yet, I think, is that it sort of consecrated the role of the Commission, even in defense. The Commission can already fund research as long as it's dual use, but it will now also be able to fund research in defense-related issues. But that would be even more creative. The Commission itself last July proposed that it could actually fund real capability projects as long as they were dual use. And other member states said, this is going very far, but but the Commission has money. The Commission is a powerhouse, and if you get it on your side, why not use it? Let us imagine that, a dozen member states get together and they want to build a drone program. The Commission needs drones too. We need drones as EU for Frontex, for our humanitarian programs, for our environmental programs, etc., etc. Why could not the Commission participate in a project as if it were an 11 member state and contribute its own share? It doesn't mean that afterwards all the capability will be Commission owned. It will be owned by who pays for it. So I would urge the member states to be very creative about that. The other level is that apart from the big programs for enablers that require really big critical mass, so you have to really try and launch them at the EU level, At the same time, all the member states, I think, would be well advised to go to continue to pool and share in the smaller clusters of member states, of which the Lancaster House Treaty is one, the Benelux, the Nordics, the Visegrad Group, the Baltic states, etc., etc. But I think we need to be a lot more ambitious. There's only very few examples of really integrated capabilities, where one doesn't just talk about integration of forces. As European Air Transport Command is a really good example that works, and there's the Belgian-Dutch naval integration that really works. Now, I know that both of these were a long time in the making, but now that they exist and we know how they work, it ought to be relatively easy to apply those lessons to more capabilities. And member states, I think, would do well to really cut the redundancy, because in spite of the shortfalls we have, there's also a lot of redundancy in Europe's military arsenal, especially in supporting structures. I always say to my own government, if apparently we're so incredibly smart in making this Belgian-Dutch naval cooperation, why is it that we haven't done the same in the Air Force yet, concentrating our two air forces on probably just two bases, one for transport and one for fighters. You don't need all the rest. You can completely merge the support, and you can do this between the Belgians and the Dutch. Maybe you can do it between other clusters of countries. We really ought to be a lot more radical about it. And I know this runs into very difficult arguments about sovereignty, etc. But with a very few exceptions, most European countries only have negative sovereignty. What is the military sovereignty of a country like Belgium? Well, we can in all independence decide what we don't want to do. But if it comes to actually doing something, there is almost nothing that we could do on our own except the National Day Parade, which is a big operation, 3,000 people, but its contribution to the security of Europe is perhaps not that big. The one word on strategy, though, I still have the feeling that to some extent our debates about capability takes place in a strategic void on the European side. We easily say, yes, we need air-to-air refueling. But to do what? The air policing of the Baltics, bombing Libya or other neighbors? Do we have a role in Asia? If we don't know exactly what the European level of ambition is, how can you decide what are your priorities and which quantities, which mix of capabilities do you really want? I think there's a real gap there in our thinking. We do planning for the alliance as a whole, of course, and on the NATO side, and we translate that into targets for the individual NATO members. But in fact, we know that more capability will come from combinations of European members, not from individual countries. And we also know, I think, that in many non-Article 5 type operations in and around Europe, it will probably not be NATO as a whole that will operate. It will be a group of European allies and partners / EU member states. So I think the real question that we need to answer still is, what is the level of ambition of the Europeans? What do they want to be able to do without the Americans? That's quite simple. Not for the fun of doing it without the Americans, but because just we need to be prepared. As you said, it may be necessary. What is it that we really ought to be able to do as Europeans without calling in American strategic enablers? We don't know that. We don't know that for sure now. In a way, there's an implicit understanding of where we feel that Europe may take the lead, but it remains a bit below the radar screen. There was a very frank and strong statement in Catherine Ashton's preparatory document for the European Council, where she said clearly Europe needs strategic autonomy. I read that as meaning we need to be able to act without the Americans if necessary. First of all, in our broader neighborhood, stretching out into the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, where we need to be able to project power to defend our interests with partners where we can, but alone if necessary. If you couple to that the fact that we'll soon have a maritime security strategy, you implicitly have two layers of responsibility where Europeans need to make a major contribution. I would personally add a third, which is exemplified by the operation in the Central African Republic, that is to do our bit for the United Nations, especially when responsibility to protect is at stake. Now, before the European Council met, I said to everybody in Brussels who wanted to listen to me, so 2 or 3 people, you should just copy and paste this, make it into one neat but very sharp paragraph, ambitious paragraph for the European Council conclusion. You would have the clearest expression yet of what is Europe's level of ambition. But, because the politics, etc., that was ignored, and all we have is a rather vague mandate to the next High Representative to do something on strategy. But it's so vague that the word strategy isn't mentioned. But I think it's really important to, final word, also make sure that we're not perennially stuck in a model of improvisation and ad hocery, where it always has to be France and or Britain that take the lead and have to improvise and craft an ad hoc coalition, which is not a criticism of France and Britain, obviously. I'm very grateful, at least in some member states, we have a strategic debate and also strategic initiative. But I just don't think this is a viable model for the future. I don't think it's viable for the others because whether they decide to join in an operation or not. Otherwise, afterwards, the dossier usually ends up on the EU table anyway. Who is dealing now with Libya is mostly on the EU table. I don't think it's viable for France and Britain either, because even though they do account for about 50% of Europe's defense effort, I don't think France and Britain have the means to pretend that they are the United States of the European continent. So the other 50%, you need to get more out of that. And part of that is the political consensus on, well, what is it for?
The way you just expressed your wishes and obviously frustrations makes me measure the extent to which we have made progress in the last 25 years. Because, I work for the European Institute. It was created in 1989. And why was it created? Because the European treaties were very limitative in what it was possible for the European institutions to do. And what they could do was only deal with trade. If the European ambassador, who at that time was not even able to bear the title of ambassador, but if he pronounced the word defense, he immediately had a number of ambassadors in his office the next day saying, you can't talk about defense. Well, the very fact that now the European Commission produces reports on the subject. The European delegation organizes a conference, an annual conference on the subject, and that everybody in the European institutions is now involved in the subject, shows the extent to which things have changed. Doesn't mean everything is clear and resolved, but I can tell you, seeing this from over the years, big difference. Leo.
What I wanted to do in just a few minutes is make a few remarks about the EU in operations from an American perspective. And so I'd like to look at this through three questions. First of all, why should the US be interested in these EU military operations? And if you're looking for a simple bumper sticker, I think it's because the CSDP is one dimension of transatlantic responsibility sharing. I don't like the term burden sharing very much. I'd like to think more in terms of responsibility. And CSDP should be an important part of that. Neither the United States nor NATO is going to be able, willing, or I would say best suited to respond to all of the potential security challenges that are out there, even though they may eventually all affect transatlantic interests. And really, that was true before the announced rebalance, and I think that remains true today and will remain true in the future. There are some other deeper concerns, I think. France, the United Kingdom, like the United States, we only have one set of forces, like the other European countries. And we will have to make tough choices about priorities. Where do we use our low density, as we call them, low density, high demand capabilities? And that will lead to some choices. I'll come back to that in the future. But we also have, as the United States, I think, a fundamental interest in seeing that European militaries can cooperate effectively in the field. If they fail to do so in an operation that's led by the EU, there will be political costs, there will be economic costs, there could be possibly costs in lives. I mean, a French or a British soldier that's wounded or killed in an EU operation, for me, that's an allied soldier that's fallen. So we have to be concerned about that. And if that happens, if an EU operation fails in some respect, it will damage the ability eventually of those countries and of other countries to work with us in NATO. So we have an interest in the success of EU operations. The second question, how these EU operations, the military operations, perform. It's hard, in fact, it would be presumptuous to try to give a global answer. But when I look at a few of the important ones, I can ask, did the relatively short EU operations in the Congo in 2003, the second in 2006, did they fundamentally change the really dramatic situation of that country? In my opinion, probably not. Did the operation in eastern Chad that took place in 2008, 2009 prevent an even worse humanitarian disaster in that area? I would say probably yes. When I look at EUFOR in Bosnia, when I look at Operation Atalanta off the Somali coast, have they had a positive impact, even though, as the Admiral very correctly pointed out, and it's true, I think, for Bosnia, the real sources of those problems aren't military. There aren't military solutions to those. And I would say, again, yes, they both had a positive impact. But when I look at three more recent cases, when I look at Libya, Mali, and the CAR, I think there's some real issues arising. Admiral Guillot, when he was testifying a couple of years ago, he was then the French chief of defense to the French National Assembly. He was very blunt on Libya, and he said the European Union really missed the boat on Libya. In the case of Mali and the CAR, the EU decided to launch missions in the wake of French interventions, with the French really doing the heavy lifting, with, I think, some very important support from the US and from the UK. But let's be frank about this. There have been some very embarrassing delays and some serious behind-the-scenes tensions over the level of commitment by EU member states. And here I'm very sympathetic to Bruno's remarks. It's kind of lonely at the top sometimes. I mean, the United States has experienced this sometimes in trying to gather support for NATO operations. And so I'm a little bit sympathetic to some of the French difficulties sometimes in gathering support for necessary, but also sometimes very rugged operations in Africa. And this perhaps helps explain why in some of the recent speeches by Secretary Hale and by the French Minister of Defense, and I would add here some remarks I heard not long ago by the British Defense Minister, you see a lot of very similar themes these days. Now, it's possible, we don't know yet, but I think it's possible that given the attention on Ukraine, the greater attention being given now to collective defense missions within NATO, it's possible that it's going to be more difficult in the future, not less difficult, for the EU to sustain participation in some missions which are rather open-ended still. It's hopeful that the AU, the African Union, eventually the UN, will be in a position to take over the burden and to really help stabilize Mali and CAR. Based on performance so far, I'm not so convinced. Finally, what should the US do or do differently with regard to CSDP missions? I'm very glad to hear on this panel, we heard it earlier in the day, the word pragmatism has been used several times. And I think that's very good. We heard some interesting examples involving AFRICOM support to the same type of mission where the EU is involved in complementary ways, and that's very good. I think there are some things that our European command, EUCOM, is also doing to improve its connections with the EU. And to the degree that our European command is oriented towards helping partners develop capabilities where they can be better security exporters, if you will, to better align that with what the EU is doing as well, and trying to develop capabilities in areas of training and so forth. That's all to the good. I would like to point out, though, I think that very quickly, there are some limitations, though, when it comes to direct US-European Union ties and cooperation in the defense area. We are members of the alliance. Not all members of the alliance are members of NATO. I mean, there's an overlap of about 22 countries now. But I think it would be difficult for any administration, Republican, Democratic, to be in a position where they would appear to be circumventing some of our NATO allies to deal directly on a NATO-EU basis. And after all, one of the strengths of NATO is that Americans, Canadians, and Europeans, we're in the same room, in the same agencies, in the same staffs at every level, working together. We're developing strategy together. We're developing interoperability together. And we're not members of the EU. And sitting across the table, the United States sitting across the table from a group of 28 EU nations who want first to come to their own opinion on things and then more or less negotiate with us, even if we're going to be a friendly partner, it's a different dynamic. And it would lead to a third problem, I think, and that is that the raison d'etre of CSDP is to create capabilities in the EU that could be used in a variety of ways, autonomously, in cooperation with NATO, in cooperation with the UN and so forth. Having a system where the EU might, in effect, come to rely on US capabilities, the way there's been kind of an overdependence in NATO, I think it's contrary to, as I said, to the raison d'etre. So we should be flexible. We should be pragmatic, but I think there will be some organizational limits. The very last word, it hasn't been, Dr. Hamry spoke of rebalance. I'd simply like to say, with regard to this whole theme of transatlantic cooperation in defense, it's not just an issue for the transatlantic community. At my institute, I've been working on an assessment of Europe and how Europe has been impacted and is viewing the US rebalance to Asia Pacific. And my partner in this, who's an Asian expert, we've had some very high-level contacts with some Asian political leaders, military leaders, and so forth. They are watching very carefully what is happening in Europe and in the transatlantic relationship, particularly now in this context of Ukraine, because Asian-Pacific allies of the United States are interested in extended deterrence. They're concerned about the problem of gray conflicts, gray zone conflicts. How do you handle that? So what we do successfully as a transatlantic community is also going to have, I think, probably very direct and very profound effect on the security architecture and the security perceptions among our Asia-Pacific allies and partners.
Thank you, Leo. Your observation on pragmatism reminds me of a word by Jean Monnet, one of the fathers of Europe and the European Union. He used to say that the governments make decisions only out of necessity, and that necessity comes out of the crisis. And so perhaps the Ukrainian situation could lead to a different way, or any crisis could lead to a different way of, or could make it possible to overcome problems with the so-called neutral states. Because when you have to do it, you do it. So I'd like to open it up to your questions. Yes, sir. Here.
Thanks. A couple of Arwan Nagadek from George Washington University. A couple of things we've heard. Two mentions of the French-British defense agreement in the context of pooling and sharing. But as I recall, even though it initially had been billed as something that could be a Saint-Malo 2, a sequel to Saint-Malo, it turned into something less than that. The punditry, at least in this country, on the so-called Lancaster House Treaty was the shock that there was barely any mention of CSDP in the bilateral British-French agreement, and that as a result, if anything, Lancaster House was bad news for CSDP, that this was not, in fact, a follow-up to Saint-Malo, but a statement that the French and British had lost patience with CSDP. Now, was that, at the time, a fair representation of what happened in 2010? And second, I suppose more for Leo and Sven, back 5 years ago, one of the buzzwords about the Lisbon Treaty's innovations was going to be permanent structural cooperation in the field of defense. That everybody knew what we were thinking, who we were looking at. I mean, the big six military powers in Europe would be able to forge ahead in a non-exclusive way and solve some of the issues that we've talked about in terms of free-riding phenomena among European nations. And we've seen some signs that PSE is still just about alive, but what's your take on the prospect that this was it a good idea, and is it still alive, essentially? Thanks.
Sven, you want to start?
2 words. On Lancaster House Treaty, I mean, I don't think it's in any way prejudices broader European cooperation. One, it gives us a very strong argument. If even France and the UK decide that in some areas they need each other, no other European country can pretend that it can do without cooperation. And I don't think the point of the Lancaster House Treaty is to extend it to more countries, but it also creates useful models that others can follow between them. Now, on permanent structured cooperation, I was very much involved in debate at the time, because we're doing a lot of work on it. And I remember that the Spanish presidency, the first one after Lisbon entered into force, invited me to speak at the official presidency event, and I received my speaker's instructions, and they said literally, the aim of the seminar is not to arrive at conclusions. Gives you an idea of the ambitions. I thought I can do that. That's an academic conference. We had then came the Belgian presidency, and we had very ambitious ideas and very concrete ideas on how to implement it. And then we realized when we did our seminar that most other member states, they were not thinking how to do it. They were thinking, well, should we do it? Now, I think PESCO is dead in the sense that we'll probably never formally activate the protocol that is next to the Lisbon Treaty. But I think it is very much alive because in the end, all of the other initiatives that we are taking, pooling and sharing, if we see them through, they will turn into something very, very PESCO-esque, What would have been the great advantage of permanent structured cooperation is that a couple of member states, among themselves, those who are willing to not just coordinate tactically project by project, but that they have a real dialogue at the level of defense spending as a whole, and that they divide the tasks between them. And this is the logical end state of any military cooperation. Belgian-Dutch naval cooperation has now gone so far that in practice we have to do binational naval planning. We cannot afford anymore to do it separately. So the more countries, the deeper they cooperate. In the end, you end up by talking at that strategic level of defense planning as a whole. So it will resemble very much that, but I would not advocate to try and relaunch the formal PESCO track because I think it's counterproductive.
Thank you. Would you like to comment?
Well, unsurprisingly, I'd agree with that analysis in that it's about encouragement. I think to use the pragmatism word, Britain and France cooperating in this manner is not exclusive. And the clearest manifestation of it, which is the combined joint expeditionary force, which will be the expression of this, the most obvious expression of it. And if we can contrive an architecture which is elegant and simple enough, then we will take all faces in the night. And we have had incredibly stalwart support through Afghanistan from the likes of Estonia and Denmark, who have cooperated in a British command and control architecture without any red cards, without any caveats, in very difficult circumstances. And we would be delighted, I'm sure, to welcome people in any way that they can contribute. But you need to start somewhere. And I think this is an attempt to produce a docking mechanism which has credibility.
One more question. We have time for one more question. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Catherine Bewley. I'm a graduate student at George Washington University. In the past, we've seen a convergence among some member states about which avenue to take as far as operations in certain crises, whether that's through NATO or EU CSPD, DP. And the UK and France, we've seen this at the beginning of Libya. So my question is, with the Ukraine crisis, is this going to help that convergence and possibly improve differences there? Thank you.
Yes. Leo.
I think it may within NATO, but there's a strong interconnection between what NATO decides to do as an alliance and what the EU decides to do in other areas. And the two are interrelated because you have some of the same members. So some of the countries within the EU, for whatever reason, because they have different ties with Russia or whatever, that they're going to be reluctant to go to very strong sectoral sanctions. within the EU, and that's something that the EU does. NATO doesn't impose economic sanctions. Those same countries may be either resistant or not participating in beefed up moves within NATO to strengthen collective defense. And I think for the United States, for policymakers, and this is not unique to this situation, but I think it's a real problem, Washington will have to find the right balance between exercising what people call, in quotes, I put quotes around it, leadership, and saying, well, this is what we're prepared to do, this is where we think we should go, while not undermining what we need to do within NATO and also with the EU, and that's to develop a consensus so that we and the Europeans are acting together. Because if it's the US always going out first, this is what we're going to do, we don't care whether or not the Europeans do this or not, what is that going to do for the sustainability of sanctions? What is it going to do for the sustainability of things that we do on the military side for reassurance? It won't help. So Washington will have to find a balance between the two. I'm perhaps more sanguine than some others that this administration can do that. And I think I give them pretty good marks so far, and I hope it will continue in the future.
Yeah, just briefly, in several occasions, what I've observed is maybe counterintuitive is it's possible to have a gap between the will to do something together and to be able to do it. For instance, you can lack a mechanism that allows a country to provide another country with the support they would like to provide. And so we very often speak about interoperability, and it's much more than just the compatibility between pieces of equipment. It includes doctrine, etc. So I think we should elevate that debate to also have any kinds of mechanisms in place between nations, between international organizations, to really be able to support each other when the will is there. Because that's really a pity when the will is there and you have difficulties to identify the authority under which you can do that and whatever. That's something we have experienced quite recently here.
Thank you. Well, we are out of time. I just want to make two very brief points before we close. One is I'd like to report about a new idea which is surfacing among commentators in Paris at this time. I think it's quite interesting. The question is, would it be a good idea to take investments in common defense out of the institutional obligations of the Maastricht Treaty criteria, which have to do with the limitation of deficits? In other words, would it be possible to finance investments in common defense out of this? Because it so happens that the countries which are virtuous by ways of Maastricht criteria are those who don't spend anything or not very much for defense investments. The countries which are not virtuous are, starting with the UK and France, those who spend a lot for defense. So could there be a European mechanism for funding investments in defense? And I think this is quite an interesting idea that should be seriously researched. My second point, also very briefly, going back to the discussion that took place this morning with John Hamway, has to do with the situation in Ukraine. Of course, we can plan very sophisticated progressive reactions, including sanctions, etc. But I am convinced, and I am not military, I am an economist, I am convinced that we need to plan for the worst because it's the best way to avoid it. And we really need to do it now. And with that, I'd like to thank the European delegation for organizing this conference, and thank you, gentlemen, for participating in this panel. Thank you, and I turn the floor to François Rivas.
Thank you, Jacqueline, and please remain seated 1 minute. Just to thank you very much for your assistance. I hope, Ambassador Hunter, your wife is better. Transmit her our best wishes of going better. This was a very interesting day. It's my third, and hopefully not last one, CSDP seminar. We have rendezvous next year. We have heard a number of messages. If I had to sum it up, I would say the tone was a bit different than the 2 previous years. And the expectations vis-à-vis Europe are higher than they have ever been. We have heard very interesting and stimulating message from John Hammerett to yours about what the EU through CSDP could do outside the area, as we used to say, but also, and this is a bit new, more globally in all its dimensions and at his own level. And I think we are going to carry back to our authorities a number of important ideas and messages. They are going to swallow it and they are going to transmit it to their successors, because next year we shall have a new administration in Brussels, and I'm sure they will use this very important product that through the years we are trying to build here to try to present you with a landscape about CSDP which will be slightly different. I hope it will be better. That I cannot predict, but I'm sure it will be different because the environment will be different anyway. So thank you once again. Thank you to the Institute of Peace for welcoming here. Thank you to all the panelists who have devoted times and again freely their knowledge and insights to help us better understanding what is at stake. Thank you, my General, for representing NATO here. As we said, CSDP is not operating in a vacuum, but in a context of important, old-established security links that we want to preserve also and strengthen as possible. Thank you to all of you for listening and being here. And thank you to the staff, and Eva, please transmit to everybody for this very nice organization. Have a good evening.